Can I teach a person with zero experience to weld in 30 minutes? So I just want to say before we get this video started that I've got zero formal experience, but I've worked in a bunch of fabrication shops over the years, and I've burnt miles and miles of wire. So I've got a ton of experience, just no formal training. And today's student that we're going to try and teach to weld is my wife, Crystal. And we're going to see if we can teach her to weld in 30 minutes. So I just want to say, last night we actually started this video. She's never welded before. So we just went through a few things last night, just so it went a little smoother today in the video shoot. And basically I just started showing her things, and this is her first weld here. You can see how rough it is, lots of porosity and whatnot in there. And they just increasingly got better. We welded for about a half an hour, and they just got better and better, and the last few beads were actually pretty good. You can see here and here are the later on welds. So what did you find was the most difficult thing, or the most challenging parts of it in the first few minutes?
It was the looking at the weld. Your whole life you're always told not to look at the weld, so to trust your visor when you put it down and start welding, that you can actually look and not squint at what you're actually welding. So it took about 10 minutes of actual welding and attempting that to actually start being able to see what you're welding. The other thing was the sparks that fly back.
Sparks.
And so, you know, that again, you know, whenever you see somebody grinding and stuff like that, you're always, you know, just standing back and being fearful of the sparks. So those are the two things I think that are the biggest thing to overcome, and was being able to actually open your eyes and see what you're welding. And the second thing was that those sparks aren't going to hurt you.
They're not going to hurt you unless you're welding naked. So what did you think? I know when you were first welding these first few welds, you had the gun way too far out, and we had talked about how much stick out, which is how much wire you have sticking out of the gun. And she had way too much stick out, and it was causing lots of trouble. And we were just working through that. So did you have a hard time figuring your depth of the gun? How close to the metal?
Absolutely, yeah. As a beginner welder, you have to get a feel as to how far that stick is away and the angle of that stick, and depending on what you're welding, from what I noticed, as to where you're actually putting the stick to weld to get the nice bead that Ron wants. So those are all things that we're going to show you, so that way we can't actually video while I'm welding where to hold the stick, but we're going to video when I'm not welding where to hold the stick and where to put the wire, so that way you can see when you are welding where it should be, and hopefully that helps.
The other thing is sound while you're welding is a big indicator of whether you have everything right, whether your wire is right, whether the speed that you're running it is right. You can actually hear, once you get used to it, you can hear when everything is right. There's a certain buzz to the welder that you'll hear. Instead of it crackling and snapping and popping, it's just a nice fizz. And lots of people say it's the sound of bacon frying. I've been told that lots in the welding shops I've worked in and whatnot over the years, is just to try and get it set up so it sounds like you're frying bacon.
And as a beginner, that is hard to hear.
It definitely is. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to weld a lap joint here. And yeah, so a lap joint is just one over the other, just like that, and we're going to weld down the seam. So what you want to do is get this in a position. You got to kind of do just do a trial run on here to make sure there's nothing in the way and you're going to do a nice smooth weld. That looks good. So then you want to get your gun angle proper. A little steeper. Yeah. And turn this with a little bit like that, so you're dragging the wire. So a simple lap joint like this, you can basically just stick your wire in the corner and pull. But typically, again, like I said, this table here works like a heat sink, so I wouldn't put my wire right in the corner. I would hold it out a little bit on the bottom plate. You'll watch the puddle come up and just start melting this top edge, and that's what you want. When it's melting the top edge, you just keep on moving. Again, it's a matter of speed and heat on how fast you can move this. Another pattern that I would use on this is, again, is like the hockey stick pattern. More heat on the bottom plate and just hook up to it. And you'll see that puddle will push up to that plate and melt, just melt the top corner of this. And then we'll see how it turns out. Then I'll do a weld exactly like it on this plate, and we'll show you guys how it turned out and how good her weld was after half an hour. That was last night that we welded, so we're like 24 hours later, so we'll see what she remembers how to weld. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna pull part of the weld, just a straight pull. Okay. And then the next one we'll try the hockey stick.
Okay.
Ready?
Ready.
There we go. See it melting the top corner?
Barely.
There you go. That's real good. All right, here you can see my welds. The left one is just a straight pull. The right one is the hockey stick. And here you can see the straight pull one and the hockey stick shaped one. That's a really good weld. Okay, so one of the things I want to talk about is prepping your steel. For the most part, you go to the steel store, you buy some steel. It's real nice, fairly clean like this stuff, though it might have oils on there that you don't see, and that can cause you trouble with your welding. Lots of times guys are just getting old used scrap. It's real rusty, and MIG welding just does not like rusty metal. TIG welding is even worse for rusty metal. You got really clean stuff. So what you want to do with your metal is grind any rust off with a wire wheel or a grinding disc or whatever. Grind it all off. It doesn't have to be super clean. Like, you don't have to get all the mill scale off down to the shiny. Just clean off all the rust and junk off of it. And the next thing you want to do, especially if it's really nasty, dirty metal that you don't know if it's been in contact with silicones and stuff like that, is to use acetone to wipe down your steel to clean it down. Do not use brake clean. You spray brake clean on this part, you wipe it off, it looks like it's all gone, but it leaves a residue on the steel that when you heat it up, it turns it into chlorine gas. Chlorine gas will kill you if you suck too much of it in. I read an article on it. I'll put a link to it right up here that you guys can go and check out and read the article on how bad the chlorine gas is to you from welding it. So do not use this stuff. So use acetone. Acetone's safe to use. Guys use it all the time for welding aluminum and steel and everything in TIG welding and whatnot. And especially like if you're welding really dirty parts like exhaust manifolds and stuff like that, it definitely helps to clean up, wire brush it, and hit her with some acetone. And that'll help your welding out tremendously. So what I'm going to show you here is a butt joint. So if you needed to weld these two pieces of steel together flat, just like that, instead of just cutting these and they're real flush and you have no gap here, you take your grinder and you grind each one of these pieces to create this V-notch in here, you can see, and that'll get your wire deeper into the crack and you'll get better penetration on your weld. It'll fill the crack completely. You could grind that off flush and it'll be a solid bead right down to the bottom of these welds. If you don't grind those edges out, you're only going to get partial penetration through, and then when you grind it off flush, you're only going to have a very thin little bead, unless you really crank your welder up. But this is the correct way to do it and the better way to do it. The way I would weld this one is you could possibly just drag down it, but I suspect your weld won't touch edge to edge unless you go too slow. And if you go too slow and you got gaps, like you can see in this metal here, she'll blow a hole through it. So on this one here, it's possible that I would do a zigzag pattern. So the zigzag pattern would be just like this. And the other pattern that I was showing you is more like, it's like a slanted zigzag, I guess. So okay, you can see the zigzag of mine, and you can see Crystal zigzag. She went a little too wide out of the crack, and her wire was going way beyond the crack. And then here's my modified zigzag, and then here's Crystal's zigzag, and you see the porosity there, the holes in the weld. She must have been holding the gun too far away, and we weren't getting the shielding gas on it, and oxygen was getting to the weld, and it created some porosity. Unless there's some contamination, there could have been some contamination in there too. But otherwise, decent welds.
So when we were first welding, you were talking about how there's two different types of methods. There's a push and a pull with that.
When you're MIG welding.
Right.
Really, it doesn't really matter. It's a matter of personal preference. Push method is basically you're angling into the steel and you're pushing it.
Pushing what?
Pushing the puddle, pushing,
that puddle.
pushing
Oh,
the
okay.
puddle, pushing the wire along. The pull method is the same thing, except you strike your arc and you pull. Shielding gas flows back into your puddle, and it makes no difference on weld penetration or anything.
Right. It's
just a personal preference, and sometimes maybe a certain position where you're welding might dictate that you need to push rather than pull, or I don't know, maybe you're welding something thick to thin in a weird position, you might need to push or pull, right?
Okay.
You might just have to play with it and figure it out.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. So now on this one, we're going to do, well, I'll do my hockey stick pattern here, and then let's try little circles. I never use little circles, but let's try it.
Yeah, let's try it.
So here I'm going to exaggerate my movements so you can see it. Normally I would make smaller movements than this, but on a corner joint like this, especially if your bottom plate is heavier than your top plate, or if you got, like this has a table underneath it, it works like a heat sink and it'll suck the heat out of this bottom plate. So you need to spend more time on the bottom plate than you do on the top. And I do what is like a hockey stick type shape. I will drag along the bottom and then I'll hook up and touch this one. Drag along the bottom, hook up and touch it. And I'll use that pattern just about all the time for these type of joints. Okay, so here's my hockey stick and my circular ones here. They're all good. She had a heck of a time. It's like she can't see where these plates are, and she's just welding the bottom plate or just welding the top, but not both of them, right?
Check out how funny that looks.
Pretty crappy. So we tossed this one aside, and with a little more instruction, we did it again. And this time it's better. Now we got the circles, it's contacting both plates. Decent weld. It started getting a little fat here, it's because you're moving too slow. There's a fine line that's too fast and too slow, right?
Right.
And then here's where you were doing the hockey sticks, and you were like up here for a while, and then you kind of wandered down here. It was like it took you a while to see what you were doing, and then you finally started, when I was telling you, more on the bottom plate and then sweep up and hit the top plate, right? And then
Yeah,
hit the
and
top
that was
plate.
working.
Hit the
Yeah.
top plate, and then once I stopped giving you instruction, it's like you started, it's like squirrel.
Squirrel! So the other thing was that you were talking about before with the wind blowing and stuff like that, and it's blowing your gas around. So what's the option for somebody though that maybe has to weld outside or something for the wind with that?
Yeah, so you can, if you need to weld outside, you know, you can use an arc welder. You can weld that thing anywhere, inside, outside, whatever. But you can also get a flux core wire, which is it's a roll of wire for your MIG welder, and it has a flux core inside of it. So you don't need shielding gas, and you just weld just like an arc welder, and it'll lay a flux over top of your bead, and you'll have to chip it off. And I mean, when I first bought my welder here for at home, I used flux core for a couple of years, and you can lay some really good beads with it. It's really no different than an arc welder, except that it's in a wire form, and it's a little more work. You got to chip the flux off before you can lay another bead.
But at least then it's a good alternative for somebody new starting off, not wanting to invest in the tanks, like
tank and the gas
and all
refilling
that
the gas,
stuff.
right?
Right. Yes.
And it's maybe a little more versatile because you can weld inside with it, or you can take it outside on a breezy day, even a fairly windy day. You can get out there and weld.
Right.
You can't do it with the gas because the problem is you get welding. This is pushing gas out of here to shield your weld. And even the slightest little breeze, if I have a fan on in the shop, it'll blow this gas around and you'll start getting porosity and crappy welds. So flux core is another option. Relatively cheap too.
Cool.
For this outside corner on a horizontal weld, you could basically just stick your wire in the center as long as you got the heat right and weld. This weld here is typically going to need a little less heat or you'll blow through this weld. So even though my welder is an automatic set, sometimes I'll turn the voltage down and the wire speed down, and then you can basically just drag. Plain old drag this joint. If you want to get fancy, you can just do back and forth movements in there. So here you can see my weld, straight pull there, and then my back and forth weave. Your first weld, you were weaving back and forth. I could hear it anyhow.
Yeah.
And then you did a straight pull, but you weren't watching the puddle eat both corners of the metal. You just started going with it. You should have buzzed there, waited for it to start eating both sides of the plate, and then slowly move and just watch it. It'll just keep eating both sides of the plate, the puddle will, as you go. Okay, so I just want to talk a little bit about some of the stuff you're going to need to get started. I'm not going into big detail and I'm not stretching this out. It's a pretty well known fact that you need a lot of this stuff. Obviously, first thing, good pair of leather gloves. You basically have two options, an auto darkening helmet and a standard one. Stays dark the whole time. It's what I learned on. It's not the easiest to learn on. I think an auto darkening, a good quality one, don't buy a cheap one. It's bad for your eyes. A good quality one, you can see through it the whole time. You can put your wire where you need it, hit the trigger, it auto darkens, and away you go, away you weld. This one here, you put your wire where you need it, you flip your head down, by then you moved your hand, and you start welding or trying to weld, you hit the trigger and you're not making an arc or nothing like that. It can be really frustrating when you're learning. I think an auto darkening is the way to go for learning, for sure. Aside, the other thing you'll need for sure is an angle grinder for cleaning your steel, grinding slag, putting bevels in your steel for getting a good weld, and a flapper disc is pretty good. This one's wore right out. The other thing you're going to want is a leather or some type of welding jacket. It doesn't necessarily have to be leather. They make lots of lightweight ones that are really good. This is just one I've used in the past in them fabrication shops I worked in. Another definite must, safety glasses. I usually in the past have not wore these, but as you get older you get safer. And you really kind of depend on your peepers. When your hearing starts going like me, your eyes kick in. So now we're going to do an inside down hand. I'm just going to tack this so it doesn't, if I bump it, it doesn't fall over. That way it'll stay there for my weld. So I'm just going to show you here, I got a bunch of wire stuck out just so you can see for a little bit better visual. You just keep your eye on the very tip of the wire. And this is the pattern I would typically use on a downhand on an inside corner. I would start welding right in the very corner in the crack of the two pieces. I'd start a bead there, and then I would just do U shapes. And you're doing the U shape, you're dropping under the puddle, and then you're pushing the puddle back up on each side of the plate. And you just continue on down there, and it ends up being a matter of speed. How fast you go down, the puddle can get away on you if you go too slow, and you can get cold lap if you go too fast. Drop down, drop your U's lower. There's my downhand in there. And we go over and see the trouble she had. The downhand weld's a tough one to do. And what ended up, you can see the blob there. She wasn't dropping her U on the pattern fast enough and below the puddle, and the puddle was getting away on her. It was going down faster than she was moving down. And this one here was actually her first attempt, which doesn't look too bad, but it's still a really thick weld. Could have been moving a little faster. So if there was something in this video that you've seen that you would like to see a more in-depth, more detailed video of, or welder setup, a little more in-depth on the welder setup, or just any other thing, you know, leave a bunch of comments below, and we get enough comments, we'll do another video on it, more in-depth. This video was just meant to be a fairly basic covering to get you started, different types of weld positions and stuff like that.
And I can weld, actually, after 30 minutes.
Some of them did turn out pretty good, actually.
Depending on the different angles, though, and stuff, it definitely was
a tough one.
A lot harder. But I think that the time in, you just have to keep welding and keep practicing. I think that makes a big difference.
Yeah.
So
the more wire you burn, the better you're going to get.
Yeah.
Really.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I need to start making chairs or something.
So here's an outside corner. Again, I got the stick out quite a bit just so you guys can see. Typically I'd run half of that much wire out. But anyhow, you'd start at the top here, and I typically on an outside corner downhand, I basically would go straight up and down. I would drop down, push the puddle up, drop down, push the puddle up, drop down, push it up. And you just continue that for the whole way. Just up and down on the weld. You could just drag it, but I like to push the puddle back up with the rod so it doesn't just keep drooping. Then you end up going way too fast, and then your weld goes for shit. It's tough, but you were getting it.
Yeah.
Okay, so here's my downhand on the outside corner. Not bad, but I started feeling like I couldn't see where I was going, and you can see I was going off to the left there a little bit. And then Crystal's downhand, not bad. Started out a little bit slow, and then she probably ended up going too fast. But down the center, but moving too fast with it. So this is thick to thin welding. We're going 1/4 inch to 1/8 inch when you're welding something thick to something thin. Typically you set your welder for the thick for 1/4 inch. This is 1/4 inch, this is 1/8 inch. So I would set my welder for 1/4 inch or 3/16, just under the 1/4, and you would spend a lot of time on the heavy plate, and then you would just touch the light plate real quick. So you go real slow on the heavy plate and then just touch the thin one. If you spend too much time on the thin one, you're going to blow a hole through it real easy. When you finish off your weld, I typically like to do a circle, 1 or 2 circles, and then stop the weld, and it'll be a nice finished weld instead of kind of a long, elongated, drawn out bead. All right, so there's my weld, 1/4 inch to 1/8 inch. And then there's Crystal. You can see evidence of cold lap there, quite a bit of cold lap. She wasn't holding enough heat on the 1/4 inch plate putting the wire too much into the corner. Lots of cold lap. And then the last one, where she pointed the gun more straight down into the 1/4 inch plate, is way better. The other thing we're going to talk about is welder selection. I've got a bunch of welders back here. This one over here is really simple to weld with, really simple to set up. All you need is wire diameter, what gas you're using, and the thickness of the steel. You put them parameters in, it automatically sets voltage and wire speed, and away you go. The amount of gas I use a C25 gas, which is part CO2 and part argon, and I use that for all mild steel type stuff. And I basically, the way I set that is I weld, I have someone turn the regulator down until I start seeing porosity or the weld starts going crappy, and then we turn it up a little bit till that goes away. And that's basically the setting I use. It's probably somewhere around 15 to 20 CFM. I'm not really sure, couldn't tell you. But that's the way I set everything up inside. No fans on. If you have any fans on in the building, it's possible it's going to blow your gas away and you're going to get porosity, and your welds are going to look like crap. We'll talk about porosity later. I'm going to attempt to weld this 22 gauge thin sheet to a 1/4 inch plate, and we'll see if I can do it. That's a really tricky weld. And I pulled her off. I successfully welded 1/4 inch to 22 gauge without blowing through, except for right at the end. Right at the end there, I blew through a little bit. If you guys want to follow me on Instagram, it's @fabin_adventures. And if you're liking the wide variety of content I'm putting out, go ahead, please subscribe.
Like and share
these videos. Hit the bell to be notified.
We want to both thank you for watching
Fabin
Adventures.
So if you want to follow me on, it'll be hit the bell to be notified of future uploads. God, that sucks.
Hit the bell to be notified of...
It's tough.
Hit the bell to be notified of future adventures. We want to thank you for watching another adventure.
That sucked.
We want to thank you for watching Fabin Adventures. What was it?
We'd like to both thank you, or with the adventures we're going on and whatnot, please go ahead.
For watching Fabin Adventures.
Fabin Adventures.
Let's try that again.
Okay.
We want to thank you both